But Mark Cuban correctly says, Democrats have policy proposals. They don't have a sales pitch to American people. So the sales pitch is not a 50-slide deck that goes through what is our Q1 plan, what is the year 2 plan. The sales pitch is the slide number 1. Tell me in 5 words, what is the vision? And Keith, what was our vision last election cycle?
Hello and welcome back to the Campaign Strategist. My guest today is Saeed Mousavi, a data scientist, pollster, and communications strategist whose work sits at the intersection of analytics, public opinion, and political influence, where he helps shape campaign strategy by translating data into actionable insight. He led integrated analytics at the award-winning Zeno Group, working with Fortune 500 brands and issue advocacy campaigns alike to refine their message and reach. He's also taught international politics, and he brings a global perspective informed by fluency in several languages and a background in both international relations and engineering. Today, we're digging into the changing communications environment, how it's reshaping campaigns, why traditional outreach is falling short, and what it takes to connect with voters who aren't tuning into the news, but are definitely hearing from the right. Saeed,
thank you so much.
It
was the most official introduction I've ever been given in my life. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing pretty well. Doing well. That's a question you have to answer with a high degree of compartmentalization these days, aside from everything going on in the sphere of politics.
I heard you were in America
things are good.
Summit. How was that?
It was great. Lots of fascinating discussions, some of which fueled my thinking and some of the stuff that I wanted to talk to you about and get your reaction to some of what we heard. How are you?
I think it's been a very busy few months. Just try to figure out the new political environment and landscape. Actually, I've done on professional side and personal side a lot of recent research, public opinion, and where we stand, and have been doing a lot of thinking since November. I'm having very honest and raw conversations on our side and in general with a lot of different people. I was excited about this conversation.
Before we jump into that, tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got into this work.
Along the story, I actually think this is an important part of my story. I was born and raised in a country that right now we as Americans don't have a good relationship with. That's a country, Iran, and under a very authoritarian regime. And people are using the word fascism and authoritarian very liberally right now. But actually, as someone who has seen 22 plus years of an authoritarian regime firsthand, it's just an important part of my story. I wasn't really that political back in Iran, because being political under that system means you are prosecuted, you're probably spending time in jail. There's no tolerating dissenting voices, basically. Back in 2009, for those people who remember, there was an election that many Iranian people thought that it was basically rigged to install a president who claimed to be a populist president, Ahmadinejad, which for those people who have been following international news, they know his name. It was a populist person with the right type of grievances and no agenda, no rational agenda to fix the economy. It sounds really familiar for people who are following US politics. The parallels are really weird because he was speaking of taking care of workers and working class in Iran. He was always talking about the people who have been, in economic terms, they have been neglected and ignored for so many years in the Iranian economy at that point. But when he was given 4 years of opportunity, he was dismantling part of government that were making decisions about macroeconomic policy in Iran. We had an office back home that was like about management and budget. They provided advice to presidents in that country, and he effectively dismantled that, and he made a lot of that type of decision. Basically, middle class in that country disappeared over his four years. And then when he was up for re-election, there was a reformist president that had a lot of support and brought a lot of people together. And a lot of people to this day, I think the election was rigged at best and was stolen at worst. You can get different narratives, but that was my introduction to politics. I was an engineer, actually. Speaking of data science, I was in engineering world and mathematics, but that was the moment that I just completely lost interest in engineering as a field. And I took a leave of absence for 6 months. My university, Sharif University, was a completely technical university. We had a bunch of philosophy of science classes, but there was no political science. I took a leave of absence. I spent 6 months in University of Tehran, which had a political science department, and I was auditing classes and I was writing papers about the green movement, and it was really intellectually stimulating and interesting. And I was participating in the protest against the regime, and I was actually doing kind of a field work talking to people. It wasn't any scientific field work, but that was my introduction to politics. I came to US to study international politics. 2 masters later, I decided I don't want to be an academic. I moved with my wife actually to Washington, DC, and with the skill set I had, I was really good at data science, mathematics, like making like a statistical models, but also had a few years studying survey methodology, studying political science, so also in this international politics. I landed in a communications firm in DC, and for more than almost 5 years doing data science, data engineering, research, I decided to get back into politics. I've been in my current organization the past more or less 2 years doing polling data and all that stuff. And actually I get that question that people think I'm crazy to have left that country, come to US, which is like economically so successful, especially with the skill set that if you have mathematics or statistics, you can go to finance. And people say I'm crazy, but I love it so far.
I was wondering, like, which people, because I assume that in the US, it seems natural to people that, like, yeah, people will want to come here from elsewhere, although maybe not as much. So you had a very secure and promising future in Iran, but you wanted
I
to
don't
come,
want to call
to
it
the
secure
US.
and promising, because to be completely honest, Pete, and this is one thing that really worries me about the state of US economy right now, there are basics to economy, right? If you want to have a prosperous country, you need to make sure that economy is growing. And Econ 101, one way that you make sure that your economy is growing by doing trade, by expanding trade and putting a wall around the country. I saw devastation and just the damage that the economy in my country took. And many Iranians got away. And actually, I have a lot of friends living in Canada, in Germany. Brilliant people, but it's just that putting a wall around the country did a lot of damage to that country for many years.
Well, that seems like a parallel of right now. The U.S. is putting up different kinds of walls, but isolating itself pretty effectively. Just out of curiosity, are there other parallels that you are noticing with steps the Trump administration is taking that you recognize as part of the authoritarian playbook in terms of managing control over the debate and the discussion?
I actually don't like to use the authoritarian label as freely as a lot of people use. I just think there needs to be a precision in conversation when we talk about the dynamics. I just think that people get desensitized if you are not precise with your language. I do a lot of focus groups, and one element for people who do focus groups, especially in politics, one element that really stands out is when someone in focus group speaks up and say, hey, I get the argument here, but this message that you're showing me is overly political. It feels like it's propaganda. I just feel like we are in this moment that American people, honestly, they want to have conversations. And that's why I want to give credit to the administration, because when they got elected, even before that, I was telling everyone, these are right grievances. If you want to make America healthy again, it's just an organic voice among many people that they feel like something is not right. You can take your argument is corporations have too much power or they are comfortable with the regulation around what they're putting on our table. You can pick any part of that conversation. But I always say these are right grievances. But there is a second part to right grievances. Are these right people with well thought out solutions to that problem? If you follow like Patrick Ruffini, he talks about vibes populism versus programmatic populism, right? If you just write the grievances, okay, great. What is the plan? And are those plans well thought out? Are they based on a true understanding of the economic or global political dynamics? Or is it just an instinct or something that you're projecting as your common sense? So that is one thing that you talk about parallel. I think there are a lot of people in my previous country that I was living. There are a lot of people that also had right grievances, but the mismanagement that was like cure was worse than the disease itself, basically.
That's interesting because in terms of identifying that, yes, there are valid grievances that I think Trump is particularly really adept at latching onto. And then, of course, he either blows them wildly out of proportion or uses those grievances to drive some hateful or ill thought out part of his agenda. I think it's becoming really clear that his effectiveness in tapping into these grievances has benefited from and helped to drive the widespread growth of the right-wing media ecosystem, because it taps into things that people feel like there's something to that. How do you look at this in the context of how the right has been able to reach so many people?
I want to take a step back. Everybody talks about the right-wing media, but I want to a little bit talk about also how the left and Democratic Party has been approaching media. And my area of expertise, the public opinion research and polling and data and RCTs, we can talk about it. A few data points I want to give you that's very interesting. I was looking at some estimate of how many hours people listen to this independent, decentralized media outlet versus your New York Times and Washington Post and MSNBC, even Fox, right? Conservative estimates. There are people who listen between 7 to 10 hours per week, active users. If you look at Spotify or Apple Podcasts, those are, depending on what type of study you look, you have more hours or less hours. But I want people to multiply that by 52 weeks in a year. And you get the range, it's between 370-ish to more than 500 hours of listening time in a year. I want you to think about it. When you write a message, if you're a political candidate or a campaign or a PAC or an advocacy group, when you write your message, your talking points, your top line, you're presenting to audiences that they have been socialized for more than 500 hours of content, listening weekly, sometimes day in, day out. What has been our model of messaging and talking to American voters? I don't say that this is everyone. There are groups, there are organizations that are thinking about it, or even they're doing like different and exciting stuff. But one thing our model has been working or has not been working is we do a sort of focus group, right? Or qualitative message. Out of that qualitative message, and based on some traditional headline where the political environment is, we translate it to some polls. We get some top lines on big frames, how we should frame issues. We get some even messaging poll, right? What is the most effective way to talk about an issue? And then if we are sophisticated, we do it through these randomized controlled trials, RCTs, right? The A/B testing, message, some stuff that's not that fancy. I think it's more pseudoscientific than scientific, but we can talk about it. And then what happens is that you produce talking points, you produce a memo, and you blast it to everyone that talks about these issues. I want you to realize that the products that you put out there, that one-page memo, it just won't work, because the pressure on a political researcher and public opinion researcher is to be as simple as possible and to give me 5 bullet points. And I use these 5 bullet points in an interview, in showing up in a TV on CNN or whatever, Fox, right? I repeat those 5 points. But remember, your audience is sitting there. They have been so good at picking up the inauthentic moments. Again, remember, you have 500 plus hours of getting educated when people are lying to you, when they're I'm sorry, explicit language, they're full of shit, or where they are being authentic. What we are seeing on the right. And I think this is a teachable moment for us, because you ask about right. There is a virtuous cycle that you have politicians that talk about certain issues that they have been picking up from the online communities that they're engaging with. They're blasting and showing up not just on Fox News, but they're showing up on anyone that gives them a platform. They're not afraid to take risks. So they make mistakes, right? They talk something, they have a backlash, someone on Twitter attacks them, but they take that risk. And then organically, they observe what is being picked up and amplified in this ecosystem. So you have this loop of positive feedback loop of what is working and what's not working. And I want to tell you one last thing, Pete. They still poll. If you look at 2024, one of the people that have been getting his briefs and reading all the polls was Donald Trump himself. You could see, based on what he was paying attention to and what he was highlighting, this guy is reading the polls, because guess what, Pete? I was reading those polls. I was doing some of those polls myself. And it's like, yep, these are all poll tested. But it was never talking points. It was never messaging. It was organic. It was connected to that virtuous cycle of taking risk on media media channels and not sounding like a robot?
There is so much that just sprouts from the whole question of what has happened to the communications environment and why does the right seem to be succeeding and the left is behind. And there's a lot of talk about that at the America Vote Summit. I do just want to go back to the way your brain is wired, just given your engineering and mathematics background. I get like precision really matters. And so for what it's worth, saying the media landscape or the right-wing media is a massive simplification of what's actually the reality. I actually find it really helpful to think about this in ecosystem terms. There is a right-wing ecosystem. If you think about the range of different kinds of species that make their living in a variety of different ways out in the real world, it's an apt metaphor for the right-wing media landscape where, sure, there's some traditional outlets like Fox and the radio show people, but then there's almost an endless array of podcasts and YouTube shows and content driven through a variety of channels in a whole bunch of ways. And a huge amount of it is not even geared for people who are looking for news or information. I think that's one of the huge things the right and people on the right have really grasped is figuring out how to make cultural connections with people, because people have lost trust in institutions. They're much more responsive to other people, and they're particularly responsive to people that they think share their values or coming from the same perspective as them. I was just looking at the Media Matters report that came out last month that had this bubble chart of basically right-wing media sphere versus left-wing. And on the right, there's almost 5 times as many followers of programs like Joe Rogan, Theo Vaughn, and the whole constellation. It's not just them compared to what's on the left. That seems to have a lot to do with the traction that they've gotten and what they're talking about. 15 or 20% of content on the right is actually characterized as comedy. Like Joe Rogan is considered a comedy, or at least they self-describe as a comedy program. So they've found lots of ways to get in. I think that certainly the election was a huge shock for Democrats in recognizing, holy crap, we're way behind. To continue the sort of ecological metaphor, to me, it's like the election and the aftermath was the comet that hit the Earth, 60 million years ago and wiped out the dinosaurs and created a huge number of niches for radiative evolution, for all kinds of new critters to find their place and find their niche. And some of them made it, some of them didn't, but they flourished, and that's what dominates now. I feel like in the media space, we're in that moment as well for Democrats and progressives on the left of having to figure out, how do we survive? How do we evolve? Because the environment has changed.
Can I add some
so
color to that?
significantly.
I was looking at
Please do.
what people,
Yes.
there was a study, I think Lupex Digital posted, they did a research, and I was looking at what people are actually listening on this independent, more decentralized, like podcasts, like Spotify and YouTube channels. 60% entertainment, they're looking for entertainment. 55% is to learn something. 52% listen while they're doing something else, just as a like auxiliary entertainment. And then only 30% said they're listening to hear other people's opinion. I just think that just gives some color to it. I want to talk about ecosystem. And I have a little bit of a hot take here. I understand the value of labeling a media outlet or a channel as this is a right wing, this is a left wing. If you're generous, some of their reports say they're independent or center. I just think some of those labels have political consequences for Democrats. If I tell you as a political candidate that A, Joe Rogan is a right-wing media or media channel or media outlet versus B, Joe Rogan is a mainstream independent media. The way that I have framed it for you of what is my risk to show up in this channel is completely now changing. I don't know if you remember the 2-3 months after the election, everybody was like talking about who is the Joe Rogan on the left. I always told my team, whoever asks you who is the Joe Rogan of the left, they do not understand this media dynamic, because that question just tells you they haven't followed the evolution of these media channels. To this day, Joe Rogan remains independent. And I want to add one more thing. Lex Fridman, don't quote me on the exact date, I think it was January or February, he puts a LinkedIn post begging people on the left to show up on his podcast. You can't believe how many times, Pete, I have posted Lex Fridman, a screenshot it, and I have sent to people. It's like, we don't know how to engage with this media. I'm sure you said, have you asked your comms director to reach out to this guy? And whoever follows their center-right, the media ecosystem, again, I think we should get away from the labeling. Yes, there are hostile environments and there are more friendly environments. Great. But I think We should get away from those labels. But first action you need to take, the first step is to engage. And you don't choose what media to engage. You go to the media that is mainstream, that people follow, not necessarily for politics, but they get their entertainment. They want to learn something. So that's number one. I want to give fiction. The second one, I want to come back to these craziness that we call public opinion research on the left and in democratic circles that is just completely out of touch with the media landscape. I argue, and I debate with everyone, if you want to invite another guest, we can debate this, that it's more set up to misdirect and misinform us than actually show us how to engage meaningfully with American voters. I don't talk about DC politics and elite audiences. I'm talking about like ordinary, everyday American. I think that public opinion research setup we have is craziness right now. And this is why the incentive and the way that you have set up this, beyond just the methodology, is you get 50-word messages. And if you actually listen to Senator Schatz, I think he showed up in a podcast, his choice words, he mentioned that it's just set up in a way that makes you talk in a least harmful way to the most number of people. Common denominator. Yeah, exactly. Common denominator. Yeah. Exactly. What happens is that it just ignores the fact that the reality of Americans live is many of these podcasts on the center and center right, if you listen to them, they get very textured and detailed. There are a lot of misinformation out there. I don't want to say that, oh, I'm talking about the accuracy. It's not about the accuracy of arguments. It's about the texture of the argument. I think you're losing a lot of arguments in giving texture to American voters. Again, I go back to the beginning. When you give that one beautiful sentence that you think it's amazing, perfectly polished, all of this are message, liberal, center, and right coded by hours of listening to these new media environments. And people just, it doesn't work.
Let me make sure I understand the current point, which is that really interesting observation about texture, just for convenience, so we don't have to have like long descriptive paragraphs. I'll say, when I say like right-wing stuff, it's not even about whether they intend to be or not. I don't think Joe Rogan identifies himself as a right-winger, but the sort of net effect is that there's been a greater balance of like, and I hate to keep talking about him because I also agree with the point. The answer is not who is the left's Joe Rogan. The answer is how do we build the ecosystem that helps a lot of different channels sprout up and carry messages in a variety of different ways and literally let evolution take its course and figure out which ones actually work and which ones don't. But anyway, the texture, I think that's a really interesting insight. So I want to hear more about it. Is the issue like you get a Democratic politician or somebody from an environmental group like on a pod, they've just got their polished talking points, but they're not comfortable going into greater depth in an interpersonal way. I think this medium is really, it's like having a conversation with somebody at a bar over a beer where it's much more relaxed, it's informal. Is that what you mean by the texture? It feels too polished, too canned, too inauthentic.
I think authenticity is one form of it. I call it socialization. I want to give you an example. And this is something that I'm struggling with. Look, again, very high level. When you ask people in polls, do you agree that we need to have a long-term plan for energy production? Is it personally important to you to have, for the US, to have a long-term energy production plan? 70% plus say, yeah. It's very important. I think you can interpret why it's important for people. I just think that it signals that things are on track. There is a plan, like they are living in a growing economy. You can interpret however you want. But 70% plus, they say yes. Again, relevant to energy, clean energies. Do you think we need to increase clean energy production and it's a high priority for you? 60+%, there's a little bit less, but 60% plus, it's important personally to me. In current mainstream fight speak, what is, if you tune into a right and center right media, when they talk about tariffs, right? Remember those two, we get back to that. But when you talk about tariffs, how are they selling the economic pain? How they are messaging it? They're saying, look, the country's on the wrong track. We have to swallow, like Trump said, like it's sometimes you should take the medicine, right? We have to swallow this. Pete, this is not one sentence. I want people to think about it. When you tell American people that we are on the wrong track economically, this is not a perfect plan, and we have a plan, that's administration says, trust me, we have a plan, there's a short-term pain. This is not a one sentence. This is a 2-hour podcast on Ruthless. This is a 1.5-hour podcast on All In Podcasts, which is Elon Musk circles. These are hours and hours of looking at this argument from every single angle, debunking the attacks. Sometimes the debunking is not really in a good faith argument. I don't want people to think that, oh my God, I think all the arguments are correct or this is the right argument. That's besides the point. But your listener has been looking at a simulation of one line that we need to go through this pain to bring manufacturing, and they have been socialized for hours. They are being inoculated against attacks against this. So a headline on New York Times, it might sound good to you as a campaign strategist, but how does it land in terms of credibility and believability with your audience? I would argue that those media environments are actually doing something more fundamental than awareness that we have to pay attention to, and they're impacting the believability and credibility and how your headline lands with people. And that's such a more important fight than just awareness. And I don't know if our democratic strategists on our side, they understand this dynamic that we are losing those credibility because exactly what you're saying, Pete, because we are not paying enough attention to those undercurrents, to those media dynamics there. Going back to my point, let's talk about manufacturing. The part of argument that says, look, we need to have tariffs because we need to have some type of protection. And then what Trump administration says is, look, you will see companies, in order to avoid tariffs, companies will say, oh, they will announce jobs and investments. Amazing, right? Great. Okay, we can agree with that. We need to take care of our working class and manufacturing. Great. Here's my problem, Pete. Looking at those two numbers, that people want a long-term plan, people want to have production. We have an argument here that, look, we already have investments like the IRA. We don't need to say IRA, but technically, we have investments, and there are many states that are using these investments to open clean energy manufacturing. Either it's battery storage or a solar farm, whatever you have, a geothermal technology. We are having this investment, and we are investing in innovation. We're investing to stay competitive with China, which, by the way, I have a crazy number. In 2020, I think China introduced more solar capacity than the entire world, everybody combined, but we can talk about it. So we are losing that fight against China, but we are investing and we are bringing this clean energy manufacturing and manufacturing jobs to the States. I have a question for Trump administration. If you truly believe and you say that you want to bring manufacturing back, great. I agree with you. Let's bring manufacturing back. But tell me, why does it make sense to take those investments away if that's truly your intent? I do not have any answer, honestly, Pete, aside from this is an ideological position they get against clean energy.
He doesn't just want manufacturing for the sake of manufacture. Look, I actually don't think he gives a crap about any of it. I think this is actually about, he likes to be the center of attention, and tariffs he can wield single-handedly. And I imagine that every country that calls him up, he's cutting some kind of a deal for a Trump resort or for a sovereign wealth fund to go to his son-in-law, or it's really about personal gain and grift. It doesn't have internal logic.
And that goes back to the texture. This is, everything comes back together. If I just want to put a poll out there, give me 10 words, what is your manufacturing argument? There's no way that any democratic strategist will say, oh, this is a simple enough message, the manufacturing, the way I articulate it here for people to see. But guess what, Pete? It doesn't mean that we shouldn't make this argument in this long form content and podcasts. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't give credit to Americans and American voters that they can listen to these more sophisticated arguments, and we can talk to them in this more nuanced and textured way. And we can talk to them why this makes sense, and we can make our case for American voters and Americans in general, which I think we have a case why it's good for the future of economy, for the future of our energy independence, and for the future of this country. But I think that is the tension that I see. It's 10 words versus hours of arguments.
During the fall campaign, when I was door knocking, I've door knocked in several presidentials going back, but this is the first time where, other than enthusiastic Democrats, almost everybody I talked to, their eyes were dead. It left me with the impression of, when I would, walk away from the door, holy crap, they have been taking in thousands of hours of content from other sources, and like 1-2 minute conversation at the door is not going to puncture the sort of the force field of information that they are now surrounded by. One of the points I'm hearing you make, you can't just say something once at a top line level and think it's going to sink in. And that's also a sentiment that I heard at the summit this week, was several people talked about, we can't just show up and start trying to reach voters 3 months before election day, because they've been getting primed in a certain way throughout the year with the hundreds of hours of content. So much of it is not even explicitly political. It's just an overarching mindset that then can be added onto or then steered in a given direction. What do you think are the most important things we need to do about this? I'll subdivide that. How should our public opinion research, polling focus groups, how does that need to evolve, do you think, in order to better guide what we're talking about? What are the other changes that you think we need to make? I'm going to preload one because you and I have talked about this a lot, which is having the right message is only now a small piece of the puzzle, but it doesn't do you any good if you can't actually get it to voters. So the other challenge is, how do we actually reach people who don't want to read fact sheets, reports, or aren't necessarily looking for the news?
Number one, what should we do? I just show up. That's 80% of the battle. I just think that right now we are coming from a very scared, risk-averse political culture on Democratic side. It has become too complicated. Now I think like one thing that has worked for Donald Trump is like they have seen all of that, but the product, it's so simple and it hits you on such an instinctual level that it just has a staying power in Republican Party and I think in American politics, whether we like it or not. I borrow it from Mark Cuban, but Mark Cuban correctly says Democrats have policy proposals. They don't have a sales pitch to American people. So the sales pitch is not a 50-slide deck that goes through what is our Q1 plan, what is the year 2 plan. The sales pitch is the slide number 1. Tell me in 5 words, what is the vision? And Keith, what was our vision last election cycle? That is the sales pitch. He doesn't get into the nuances. I don't say his administration will have to deal with the reality of those nuances, because if they really want to jumpstart coal, they have a serious pollution problem on their hands. And that's why they try to talk about coal as clean coal, which, by the way, nobody's that stupid to buy that, but whatever. What I'm trying to say is that it's a sales pitch. It doesn't argue, uses the brand equity that Republican Party and Donald Trump has built, but it sells you, it hits you at a very instinctual level. We don't have that approach. We still think in paragraphs of arguments. We still think that people are 100% rational. People are emotional beings. They want to be hopeful and they have fears. And if your sales pitch don't talk to their hopes and don't address their fears, it's game over. You're not there. You're not on their radar. Show up in mainstream fights. Get out of your corner and see what actually people want. Once you look at the polls and the data, you realize some really interesting stuff. The things that American people want are simple. They want energy independence. They want to have cheap access to cheap energy. And once we give them cheap energy, they want that energy to be clean. So they have this strong preference for clean energy when we give them cheap source of energy, right? It's simple. It's not a paragraph long. It's not, this 3D chess puzzle that Democratic strategists play and they look at 50 slide deck. It's simpler than that. I think the linear model of focus group, poll, RCTs is broken. And it's broken because we have decoupled the media research from our public opinion research. Our public opinion research is very much informed by traditional media and informed by DC fights. The real conversation is happening somewhere else. And the public opinion research is not paying attention to that mainstream fight and mainstream socialization of American voter.
I was thinking about it in a little bit of a different way a few minutes ago. Democrats have become trained on figuring out the perfect soundbite, right? And then you repeat it on every network you go onto and you give the same soundbite to the Post and the New York Times. And that used to set the overall narrative, which of course is what drove conservatives nuts and caused them to create their own ecosystem of news and information. How do you reshape the research in order to fit what the modern communications landscape
there are
looks like?
new architectures that we're working. The difficulty, Pete, is the people who have access to power, the centers of power and access to money. I haven't seen a serious conversation, people questioning the public opinion research and RCTs and focus group that we do things. I don't say there are no conversation. I'm sure people have conversations, so I don't want to project. that there's no conversation. When you talk about them, about newer research paradigms, community focus groups like World Cafe Method, continuous online marketing, online panels, like these other forms of stuff that helps us to be engaged at a more direct level with voters, I haven't seen any serious conversation out there. I have been working myself, like I plug in myself, I have been working on what is the architecture that gets us closer to voters. And they take us from this reactionary research, which means by the time you hear a message from a voter in focus group or you see something shows up in the data, in the crosstabs from your poll, it's already too late. That message has been talked about in the media and people have been socialized with people. So you get into this reactionary cycle of responding to instead of proactively campaigning for your issue. And that's the one you will see our research infrastructure in 2024 put us in a reactionary cycle. And we didn't even react to that reactionary cycle very well. So you can make that case. But even the research itself was always in this reactionary cycle. You need new research forms to detect signals early, and you need to democratize. This is what I call monopoly of interpretation. You get all this information, but all of them are interpreted by a very few number of people in Washington, D.C. You need to democratize that to take those early signals more seriously, Pete, because if you're all the time paying attention to CNN, MSNBC, read New York Times, read Politico Morning Edition, listen to Punch Bowl, it's so easy, Pete, to ignore those early signals. The MAHA movement was an early signal that you could detect years before. The housing crisis, Pete, didn't happen in the year of election. People were talking about housing 3 or 4 years before that. There is a reason we detect those signals not early enough. And I want to push people to question the way that we do public opinion research, message testing, RCT. That keeps us in a reactionary cycle.
I think that's a great insight. What I'm hearing is that we need to shift how our opinion research works to not be looking for the perfect combination of words, but instead make it more sort of sentiment and value based to pick up on what are people talking about in general. Because the way to be effective in today's environment is, again, not thinking just you can rattle off the same soundbite over and over again, but to understand what are people's hopes and fears so you can talk about, here's our plans for how we're going to help with those things. If you're in a conversation, you don't say something exactly right the first time, people generally, you've got an opportunity to come back and try again and rephrase it and maybe try to articulate the same thing on the same topic in a few different ways. And to me, that's like the shift that we've got to make that goes along with there's more and more places to have these conversations. And it is weird, right? Given that we're in what people call the attention economy, that people actually are listening to 30-minute podcasts, in some cases 3-hour-long podcasts. It's not just beaming facts and figures and polished phrases at them. It's because it's real people talking and stumbling and misspeaking some, but they keep trying and coming back to the main point to try to capture what do they mean, what they want to say. To me, that's part of why it's about authenticity, not authority. What's going to make someone want to keep listening?
Yeah, can I tell you one thing? And this comes from my own experience. The year is 2019. I'm doing the context doesn't matter. I'm doing some in-depth interviews in Florida. I'm traveling up and down I think it was from September till November. I was going up and down the state, and I was doing interviews with business leaders, with religious leaders, with all type of minority leaders in Florida. I came to DC. I remember I had this meeting with my future employer, with my future boss, and he was asking me, "Hi, how was your research down in Florida?" I was like, I got the signal that we live in a post-identity America. And by the way, this is not 2020, this is 2019. And it didn't come from a fancy poll or a fancy focus group. It was Saeed traveling up and down, and the total budget, Pete, for that research that I had was $8,000. That's it. That had to feed me, put me in hotels, by the way, very bad ones, not really luxurious ones. I had to rent a car to travel. It was ahead of its time. Actually, 2020 happened, and I was like, oh, maybe that was the wrong signal. Maybe I overread into that signal, overinterpreted it. But 2024 came with a vengeance. Sometimes we are more obsessed with the shiny data sciencey stuff, and as someone who can sell data sciencey stuff, it sells, right? But a good grasp of research, that's timeless. As a party, Democrats have lost that art of being connected to people in more organic type of researches, which academia, ethnographic research, these are way mainstream, but like in-depth interviews, all of those stuff, we need to bring them up. We need to de-emphasize the obsession with data, which is not serving us, has not served us. It can give us some sort of where the country is headed, some long-term thinking. There's a value to that, Pete. I don't say throw it away. That's not the point. Have that. But remember, that should inform a vision and a strategy, and that shouldn't be an excuse not to get closer to American voters through these other types of research. I tell you one last thing. It's really tough when you pitch these ideas to donors because some of them are not as shiny. Some of them are more complicated. The architecture that I told you, from focus group to polls to RCTs to decision, it's so simple to package and sell it, but it doesn't serve. It doesn't serve us completely. You need a more complicated architecture, but when I put this in front of people, more sophisticated architecture that give us early signals of early ones that don't show up in your RCTs, don't show up in your polling, your focus group, it's too complicated to say, oh, this is sexy, let's fund it. It's not that. That's part of the challenge we have. I always ask this question from donors or people who I show these ideas. Does it speak to a true need? The answer is always yes. So why aren't you funding it? So that's my way of saying another layer of challenge that we have in bringing these newer approaches to research.
And that's another theme I've been hearing a lot about, the need for investment, the uncertainty among donors who I think are still shell-shocked by the election and these drastic changes. I think as anybody in the progressive sector knows, a lot of the money is moving very slowly right now. And my sense is because people want to feel like they know what's going to work, right? But the only way to find out what's going to work is to invest in a whole bunch of different things, try them out and see what's sticking, and then do more of that. So what does that more complex infrastructure or architecture look like? Because my sense is, like monitoring what are the big topics that are being discussed on the various social media channels. And I'm sure there's some matching that up with traditional polling and so on to try to figure out, okay, what is it people are really worried about? Is that right? Is that just the starting point? Where does it go from there?
Okay, so I acknowledge one thing, and I want to be very clear because this is intellectually honest conversation. Many of the methods that we have in corporate world doesn't translate to politics. Why? Because in corporate world, you have quarterly performance data. Even, if you have a good analytics infrastructure, you have daily data, you have hourly data, even depending on how well thought out your infrastructures are, right? In politics, you have what? Every 4 years general election, 2 years midterm, some states every year, and sometimes you have a special election that you can try things out. My mind was blown, Pete, that we don't have a proper branding research in politics. I thought that politics, like in the US, at least politics, 80% of politics is communications. And then the most important element in communication is a branding research. And branding research is not messaging research, is not a baseline tracker. Branding research talks about values, aspirations, fears, and how they change by time. It's a pulse check of where Americans are, and there's no freaking policy question there. The second one is there are more decentralized qualitative research in corporate world that I have shaped some of them, I have participated. And the main goal of those more decentralized qualitative research, some of them are like now well documented, like World Cafe that I talk about with a lot of people. It's a method, it's really well documented, is to decentralize and disempower the moderator to introduce the bias of the moderator in the conversation. The first thing you see in the focus group is that the moderator, first of all, manages the focus group, meaning that moderator incentivizes what we'll be discussing in this session and disincentivizes what we are going to stay away from this conversation. Corporations, I think they have been going through more this moderator-less, more decentralized qualitative research. There are a lot of times that we get high quality data from the field, but the reason that it's not communicated because somebody with power in the room doesn't believe that it's important. I'm talking RFK movement. For people who are looped in, that why we didn't pay attention or why we ignored it for such a long time.
That RFK would actually help
or his agenda.
I made exactly the same error. I was like, what the hell is he going to add? After the election, it's become more and more evident. There's a significant slice who was brought in by, notwithstanding eating roadkill.
But the monopoly of interpretation is a huge bottleneck. You will realize this world is so small, Pete, but I just think that it's not serving anyone when we get get all of this data, and then there are very few people that decide what gets in front of people and what gets ignored. And that's a third element I think we should have a solution for.
It's tuning out an important signal about what people are actually thinking about or responding to. We need to be able to talk about the overall topic more and in greater depth and in a lot more places with a lot more different kinds of people than we have before. One of the strategies that people are exploring is how do we work with creators, which of course happens a lot on the right. But there's a really interesting tension there, because this is probably true of any lefty group, or in fact was probably true of any organization until some years ago, wanting to very tightly control the message. And I've been there myself. I worked at a big environmental NGO, and I was the pain in the ass who was like, I want to see every single press release on this before it goes out. And I was micro editing the crap out of them. The desire to both have the message in your brand and then exactly as you want it, because there's all these policy nuances you got to worry about. People in DC particularly tend to overthink about how the Hill will react, and they forget about the fact that this message will only help if regular people can latch onto it. There's a tension between wanting to tightly control the message versus these days, you've got to be willing to let go and let people talk about your thing in the ways that is true to their experience, that is authentic to them and is authentic to their audience, which means if you try to tell them you have to say it exactly this way, it won't sound authentic and their audience won't pick up on it. And that person's going to be like, this is not working for me. Can we navigate through that tension? To me, that's one of the big ways that groups are going to need to adapt, is getting comfortable with helping more conversation on the overall topic of there's too much carbon pollution, it hurts our health, without getting so detailed about exactly how that has to be characterized.
At the end of the day, you can have the perfect message in DC. You can talk to people on the Hill in a very effective way. But if you forget voters, you will lose saliency. And if you lose saliency, good luck talking to people in DC for a long time. And this is not only our issue, this is any issue. If you lose saliency, it's game over, because there's a time that's like, what issue is that? Why should I care? If you don't have long game with voters, it just doesn't matter how much you put energy there. You can win the battle, but you lose the war, right? That's number one. Number two, of course we can navigate it, because we have the arguments we have. I think we have winning arguments on our side. You poll anyone, say, hey, do you want pollution in your water or air? Everybody hates it. 75% plus of people say, I hate it. I don't want pollution. And then we talk about it and we talk about it. Look, you have an administration that doesn't have any problem with, in name of deregulating, they're just letting a bunch of polluters to do whatever they want without paying attention to your health. That's the negative messaging. But the positive messaging, who doesn't want to compete effectively against China? Who doesn't want to win a race against China? This is America. We are a competitive nation by nature. We want to always win. Who doesn't want to win on every dimension against China? The same argument we need to make on energy. If you just rely on coal and oil and gas, good luck. See you in 20 years when China is completely outclassed our energy production and manufacturing, and we have completely lost the energy game to them. That's a winning argument. My point is that when you have a bunch of winning arguments that it speaks to the values that Americans carry, it speaks to their aspiration. We want to be an energy abundant country. Let it go a little bit. You can make mistakes, but if you don't show up because you're scared, you have lost the war before even showing up to it. To me, one part of it is de-risking these media environments. And this de-risking is a work of a democratic strategist. To say that if you show up 50 times and make mistake in 3 of them, what is it? That's 6% failure rate. It's totally fine. But if you show up one time, I'm talking about that infamous CNN interview, if you remember 2024. If you show up one time, fail one time, that's 100% failure rate. But if you show one time and you're succeeding one time, it's one time. Everybody hates pollution. Everybody loves to win energy competition with China. If you have this winning tense, your only work is letting it go, let people make those arguments and show up and defend your position. Don't be scared. Everything will be fine in the long term. You're micromanaging your messaging to the Hill. It's important. I don't say it's not important, but in the long term, it's not as important as winning the saliency game.
I think that's a great place to wrap the main conversation. I like to close up with, what is some advice that you got from a mentor maybe early on in your career that you'd like to share?
I think it's my personality. I really like when people speak to the truth and they're fighting the real fights versus wasting their energy. That means that sometimes I just bump heads with people. The biggest advice is just the simplest and the oldest advice ever: choose your battle. Know when you are most effective. And I think one of the biggest thing I learned from actually someone in my current organization who left the organization a while ago was remember change in a relational basis. When you have a relationship with someone, it's easier to effect change. Don't underestimate the friendships you make, and don't underestimate these simple conversations that we have is part of the battle, is part of the war, that we want to course correct things in a way that works.
Saeed, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. This has been a great conversation. I look forward to more. So thank you so much. Thanks for tuning into the Campaign Strategist, where we dive into the art and science of advocacy. The podcast is produced by Prismatic Strategies to share wisdom and insights from leaders in the field. I'm your host, Pete Altman. Music was written by Andrea Perry and Pete Altman, and this is edited by Abby Altman. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others who care about making a difference. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again, and see you next time.